At my son's wedding, they replaced my seat with a trash bin, and when I looked up, my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "Relax, it's just a prank." I remember the exact way the sunlight came through the tall glass windows of the reception hall, warm and golden, the kind of light that makes everything feel softer than it really is, the kind of light that hides sharp edges until you're already cut by them. I had spent the entire morning getting ready, taking my time with the navy blue dress I'd bought just for this day, smoothing out every crease, adjusting the pearl necklace my late husband had given me on our 30th anniversary, telling myself that today was about love, about family, about watching my son begin a new chapter of his life. When I arrived at the venue, guests were already gathering, laughter drifting through the air, champagne glasses clinking softly, and for a moment, I let myself believe I was part of it all, that I still belonged in this family I had built with my own hands. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel looked handsome standing at the altar, his shoulders straight, his smile polished, and Jessica walked down the aisle like she had stepped out of a magazine, every detail perfect, every movement calculated, and I clapped along with everyone else, my chest tight with something I told myself was pride. It wasn't until the reception, when guests began finding their seats, that something shifted. I walked toward the table assigned to me, my heels tapping softly against the polished floor, my eyes scanning the neatly arranged place cards, and that's when I saw it. My name wasn't printed on a folded card like everyone else's. Instead, there was a small handwritten label taped to the side of a metal trash bin positioned awkwardly at the edge of the table. Margaret Collins. For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake, some kind of mix-up by the staff, something that could be quietly corrected if I just asked the right person. But before I could even take a step back, I heard Jessica's voice behind me, light and amused, as if she were commenting on a harmless joke. "Oh, you found your seat," she said, and when I turned, she was smiling, that bright, practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Relax. It's just a prank." A few people nearby chuckled, not loudly, just enough to let me know they had seen, that they understood what was happening, and that they had already decided it was funny. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of their attention, the way their eyes lingered just a second too long before looking away, pretending not to stare. I adjusted the strap of my purse, smoothed down the front of my dress, and then, without saying a word, I pulled out the chair beside the bin and sat down. The metal lid reflected a distorted version of my face, and I caught a glimpse of myself in it, smaller somehow, like I had been reduced to something less than what I was just moments before. The music started again. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of food, and the room filled with the easy rhythm of celebration. But underneath it all, there was a quiet shift, something subtle but undeniable, like a current running beneath still water. I picked up my napkin, placed it carefully on my lap, and reached for the glass of water in front of me, my hands steady, my movements precise. Across the room, I saw Daniel laughing with a group of guests, his arm draped casually around Jessica's waist, and for a brief second, our eyes almost met. Almost. But then he looked away, turning slightly as if something more interesting had caught his attention, and that was when I understood. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a prank that had gone too far, or a joke that someone would apologize for later. This was intentional, planned, allowed. I took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness settle in my chest, and listened as the laughter around me continued, bright and effortless, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. And that was the moment something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door closing in a distant room, final and irreversible. I didn't react. I didn't speak. I simply sat there, watching, listening, remembering every detail. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that people always reveal exactly who they are when they think you have no power left to respond. I stayed at that table longer than I needed to, long enough for the initial wave of curiosity to pass, long enough for the whispers to settle into the background noise of polite conversation, and long enough to understand that no one was going to step in and fix what had been done. A server approached with a tray of appetizers, offering them with a practiced smile that never quite met my eyes. And for a brief moment, I wondered if she had been told where to place me, if she had hesitated even slightly when she saw my name attached to something so deliberately out of place. I took one of the small plates from her tray, thanked her softly, and placed it carefully on the table beside the metal bin, treating the moment with the same quiet dignity I had carried through every difficult situation in my life. Around me, conversations continued as if nothing had happened, voices rising and falling in easy rhythm. But every so often, I caught fragments of sentences that trailed off when I turned my head, laughter that softened just a little too quickly, eyes that flicked toward me before darting away. It was not loud cruelty, not the kind that announces itself openly, but something quieter, something more refined, and in many ways, more cutting. I picked up my fork and took a small bite, not because I was hungry, but because it gave my hands something to do, something to anchor me in the middle of a room that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite being filled with people I knew. Across the table, a couple I recognized from Daniel's college days exchanged a glance before one of them leaned in and whispered something to the other, their expressions shifting into something that looked almost like sympathy, but neither of them spoke to me directly, and I realized then how easy it was for people to witness something uncomfortable and choose silence instead. I let my gaze drift across the room, taking in the details I had missed earlier, the way the seating arrangement had been carefully curated, families grouped together, friends clustered in familiar circles, every place card printed in elegant script, every chair positioned with intention, and yet mine had been replaced, not accidentally, but deliberately, with something that could not be mistaken for anything else. This was not oversight. This was design. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tablecloth before I forced them to relax, smoothing the fabric absent-mindedly as I had done 1,000 times before during family dinners, birthday parties, holidays I had hosted in my own home, back when my presence had been expected, even valued. I remembered how I used to set the table for 8, sometimes 10, making sure every detail was just right, folding napkins carefully, arranging plates so that everything felt welcoming, balanced, complete. Back then, there had always been a place for me, not just physically, but emotionally, a sense that I belonged within the structure of the family I had spent decades building. Now, sitting at the edge of this table, beside something meant to collect what others discarded, I felt that shift more clearly than ever before. A movement to my left caught my attention, and I turned slightly to see one of the event coordinators speaking quietly with a member of the staff, her expression tight, her eyes flicking briefly in my direction before she leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. The way she nodded, the way the staff member hesitated, and then the way both of them chose to walk away without approaching me told me everything I needed to know. This had been noticed, and it had been allowed. I reached for my glass again, taking another slow sip, letting the moment settle rather than rushing to fill it with reaction, because reacting would have given them something, some visible sign that their actions had landed exactly where they intended. Instead, I observed. I listened. I began to piece things together, small details that had not seemed important before, but now formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The invitations that had arrived late, after most of the planning had already been done. The dress fittings I had not been invited to attend. The conversations that had ended abruptly when I entered the room during the weeks leading up to the wedding. At the time, I had told myself it was nothing, that younger people had their own ways of doing things, that I did not need to be involved in every decision. But sitting here now, with the soft clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation surrounding me, I could see those moments for what they really were, not isolated incidents, but pieces of a larger picture that had been forming quietly, steadily, without my full awareness. I glanced once more toward Daniel, watching as he laughed at something Jessica said, his posture relaxed, his attention entirely focused on her, and I realized that whatever line had been crossed today, it had not been crossed suddenly. It had been approached gradually, step by step, until this moment felt natural to them, justified even. I set my glass down gently, aligning it with the edge of the plate, and folded my hands in my lap, my posture straight, composed, unchanged on the surface, but inside, something had shifted into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not about a seat. It was not about a joke. It was about position, about value, about where I stood in a family that no longer saw me the way it once had. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether I was imagining it and started accepting that I was not. I did not leave my seat when the first course was cleared, even though every instinct in me suggested that I should quietly excuse myself and disappear before anyone could notice me again, because leaving would have confirmed something I was no longer willing to accept, that I did not belong there, that I had been successfully pushed out of a space I had once held without question. Instead, I remained exactly where I was, my posture straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap between each course, observing the room with a level of attention I had not used in years, as if I were seeing everything for the first time without the soft filter of assumption and trust. The speeches began shortly after. Glasses were raised, chairs shifted, and the gentle hum of conversation settled into attentive silence as Daniel's best man stood to speak, his voice warm, filled with stories of friendship and shared history, moments that painted Daniel as loyal, kind, dependable. I listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the way people reacted, the nods, the smiles, the easy agreement that followed each compliment, and I realized how simple it was to maintain an image when no one questioned it. When it was Jessica's turn to speak, she stood gracefully, smoothing the front of her dress, her smile bright and effortless, and as she spoke about love, about partnership, about building a future together, her voice carried clearly across the room, practiced and steady, every sentence landing exactly where it was meant to. She thanked her parents, her friends, the people who had supported her along the way, and then she turned slightly toward Daniel, placing a hand lightly on his arm as she spoke about the life they would create together, a life built on respect, understanding, and shared values. There was a pause, brief but deliberate, and for a moment, I wondered if she would acknowledge me, if there would be even a passing mention of the woman who had raised the man standing beside her. But the moment passed quietly, and she moved on without hesitation, as if that part of the story had never existed. The room responded with applause, warm and approving, and I joined in, my hands moving automatically, the sound blending seamlessly with the rest of the guests, even as something inside me settled into a colder, clearer understanding. This was not just about exclusion from a seat or a planning process. This was erasure, subtle and complete, executed in a way that allowed everyone involved to maintain the appearance of kindness while quietly removing me from the narrative altogether. I let my gaze drift again, this time more deliberately, noting the small details that others might overlook, the way Jessica's friends leaned in close to her, their expressions open and supportive, the way Daniel mirrored her posture, his attention anchored firmly at her side, and the absence of any space that might have once been reserved for me. A server approached to refill glasses, moving efficiently from one guest to another, and when she reached my place, she hesitated just slightly, her eyes flicking from me to the bin beside my chair and then back again, a brief moment of confusion that she quickly masked with a polite smile. I thanked her quietly, accepting the refill, and watched as she moved on, her pace just a fraction quicker than before, as if she wanted to put distance between herself and the discomfort she had just encountered. It was in that small, almost imperceptible interaction that something else became clear to me, something I had not fully considered until that moment. This arrangement had not only been planned, it had been communicated, understood, and accepted by the people responsible for making this event run smoothly. There had been opportunities to question it, to adjust it, to quietly correct what was obviously inappropriate, and yet no one had done so. That realization did not bring anger, not in the way I might have expected, but rather a sense of clarity that felt almost steadying. I was no longer trying to interpret what I was seeing. I was no longer searching for alternative explanations or softer meanings. I was simply acknowledging what was in front of me. The music shifted again, signaling the transition into the next part of the evening, and guests began to stand, chairs scraping softly against the floor as people moved toward the dance area, their laughter returning, their conversations picking up where they had left off, as if the brief formality of the speeches had never interrupted the flow of celebration. I remained seated for a moment longer, watching the movement, the easy way people gravitated toward one another, forming familiar groups, reinforcing connections that did not include me. And then, slowly, I stood. I smoothed the front of my dress once more, adjusted the clasp of my necklace, and stepped away from the table, leaving the bin exactly where it was, untouched, unchanged, a quiet symbol of something that no longer needed to be questioned. As I moved toward the edge of the room, I passed by a mirrored column, and for a brief moment, I caught my reflection again, clearer this time, not distorted by metal or distance, and I saw not the diminished version I had glimpsed earlier, but something steadier, something more resolved. I had spent years believing that maintaining peace required silence, that preserving relationships meant overlooking small discomforts, that love could be sustained through patience alone. But standing there, watching a celebration unfold without me, I understood that silence does not erase what is done. It only delays the moment when it must be faced. And as the music swelled and the lights softened across the room, I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by what they expected of me, but by what I had finally begun to see with complete and undeniable clarity. The air felt different once I stepped away from the table, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as if the noise of the room had separated into layers and I could finally hear what had been underneath all along. The subtle tones people use when they think no one is paying attention, the half-finished sentences, the quiet acknowledgments passed between glances instead of words. I moved slowly along the edge of the reception hall, keeping my pace measured, my expression calm, allowing myself to blend into the background in a way I had never consciously done before, and as I did, I began to notice how easily people revealed themselves when they believed they were not being observed. Near the bar, a small group of Jessica's friends stood in a loose circle, their voices low but not low enough, their laughter soft but edged with something sharper beneath it. And as I passed within a few feet of them, one of the women tilted her head slightly and said, "I still cannot believe she actually sat down," followed by a quiet laugh that was quickly echoed by the others. Another voice responded, "Jessica said she would, that she is the type to just take it." And there was a pause, brief but telling, before someone added, "It is kind of sad, though," in a tone that suggested the sadness was more theoretical than real. I did not slow down, did not turn, did not give any sign that I had heard them, but I carried those words with me, fitting them carefully into the pattern that had already begun to form in my mind. A few steps farther, near one of the tall floral arrangements, I noticed two members of the event staff speaking quietly, their posture angled toward one another in the familiar way of people sharing something they should probably keep to themselves. I asked about it earlier. One of them murmured, glancing briefly toward the tables, but the bride said it was intentional, that it was supposed to be funny, and the other gave a small shake of her head before replying, "It did not feel funny." There was no malice in their voices, only discomfort, but even that small exchange confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not an accident. It had been discussed, approved, carried out with full awareness of what it would look like and how it would be received. I continued walking, my steps steady, my hands relaxed at my sides, until I reached a quieter corner of the room, where the music softened slightly and the crowd thinned just enough to allow for a moment of stillness. From there, I could see Daniel and Jessica more clearly, surrounded by guests, moving easily from one conversation to another, their smiles effortless, their gestures practiced, and for a moment, I watched them not as a mother watching her son, but as an observer studying a scene with no personal attachment. Daniel leaned in as someone spoke to him, nodding, laughing at the appropriate moments, his attention fully engaged, and Jessica stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, guiding the rhythm of their interactions in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. There was a confidence in her posture, a certainty that everything around her was unfolding exactly as she intended, and that realization settled into me with a quiet finality. I thought back to the weeks leading up to this day, to the small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, the unanswered calls, the brief replies to messages that once would have been longer, warmer, more engaged. I remembered standing in my kitchen one afternoon, phone in hand, reading a text from Daniel that said they were too busy with wedding preparations to meet, even for a quick lunch, and telling myself that it made sense, that young couples had so much to manage, so many details to coordinate. I remembered offering to help, suggesting small things I could do, and receiving polite but distant responses, each one closing the door just a little more, without ever making it obvious that the door was being closed at all. At the time, I had chosen to interpret those moments with generosity, to assume the best, to give them space without asking why that space seemed to be expanding in only one direction. Now, standing at the edge of the room, Watching the easy flow of a celebration I had been carefully positioned outside of, I could see those moments differently, not as isolated incidents, but as deliberate steps, each one creating a little more distance, each one reinforcing a boundary I had not realized was being built. A soft movement beside me drew my attention, and I turned slightly to see an older woman standing nearby, someone I recognized vaguely from past family gatherings, though we had never spoken at length. She offered me a small, hesitant smile, the kind that carries more understanding than words ever could, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though she might say something, might acknowledge what had happened in a way that no one else had. But after a second, she simply nodded, her expression tightening slightly, and then she turned away, rejoining the flow of guests with a practiced ease that suggested she had learned long ago how to navigate moments like this without becoming part of them. I did not feel anger watching her leave, only a quiet recognition of how these situations sustain themselves, not through overt cruelty alone, but through the absence of intervention, the collective decision to look away rather than disrupt the comfort of the room. I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just enough to mark the shift within me, and as I did, I realized that whatever uncertainty had lingered before was gone. There was no longer a question of intent, no lingering hope that this could be explained away or softened into something less deliberate. What remained was clarity, steady and precise, and with it, a sense of direction that had not been there before. I straightened slightly, adjusting my posture not out of habit, but with intention, and turned my attention back to the room, not as someone searching for a place within it, but as someone beginning to understand exactly where she stood outside of it, and what that position would require moving forward. By the time the dancing began in earnest, the room had shifted into something louder, brighter, easier to ignore if you wanted to pretend everything was as it should be, but I no longer had any interest in pretending, not for their comfort and not for my own. I moved toward a small side table near the edge of the dance floor, picking up a fresh glass of water even though the one in my hand was still half full, simply to give myself a reason to stand still and watch without drawing attention. And as I did, I noticed a familiar face approaching from the opposite side of the room. It took me a moment to place her, but then I recognized her as Linda Harper, an old friend of my late husband, someone who had attended more than a few of our family gatherings over the years, someone who had always been kind in a quiet, observant way. She slowed as she reached me, her expression thoughtful, her eyes taking in the space around me before settling gently on my face. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice carrying a tone that was neither pity nor surprise, but something steadier, something more deliberate. I offered a small smile in return, one that felt natural rather than forced, and nodded in acknowledgement. "It has been a long time," I replied, keeping my tone even, my posture composed. She glanced briefly toward the tables, toward the place I had left behind, and then back at me, and there was a pause, a measured silence that seemed to hold more meaning than any rushed explanation ever could. "I saw what they did," she said quietly, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a simple acknowledgement of fact. I did not respond immediately, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted to hear what she would add without prompting. And after a moment, she continued, lowering her voice just enough to separate our conversation from the noise around us. "This was not last minute," she said. "I overheard Jessica speaking with the planner earlier this week. She was very specific about where you would be placed. The words did not shock me, not anymore, but hearing them spoken plainly, without hesitation or softening, solidified something that had already taken shape inside me." I held her gaze for a moment, letting the information settle, and then nodded once, slowly. "I thought as much," I said, my voice steady, my tone free of the uncertainty that might have been there even an hour earlier. Linda studied me for a second, as if assessing something deeper than my words, and then she gave a slight nod of her own, a quiet recognition that I understood more than I was saying. "You are handling this well," she added, though there was a subtle weight behind the statement, as if she knew that handling something well did not mean accepting it. I allowed myself a small exhale, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to release the last trace of hesitation that had lingered beneath the surface. "I have had a lot of practice," I replied, and for the first time that evening, there was a faint edge to my voice, not sharp, but present, a quiet shift that did not go unnoticed. Linda's expression changed slightly, not with surprise, but with something closer to approval, and she leaned in just a fraction, lowering her voice further. "Your husband trusted you with everything," she said, choosing her words carefully. More than most people realized. I felt a subtle tightening in my chest at the mention of him, not painful, but grounding, like the steady weight of something that had always been there even when I had not needed to think about it. I met her eyes again, this time with a clearer sense of where the conversation was leading, and she held my gaze for a moment before continuing. "He was very particular about how things would be handled," she added, "especially when it came to family." There was no need for her to say more, not in detail, not in specifics, because I understood exactly what she was referring to, not just the legal documents, not just the formal arrangements, but the quiet conversations we had shared over the years, the assurances he had given, the careful way he had structured everything to ensure that what we had built together would not be easily undone. I straightened slightly, my posture shifting not out of habit, but with intention, and for the first time since I had walked into that room, I felt something other than observation and understanding take hold. Direction. I looked past Linda for a brief moment, toward the center of the dance floor where Daniel and Jessica stood surrounded by guests, their laughter blending seamlessly with the music, their movements confident, unbothered, and I realized that whatever they believed about me, whatever assumptions they had made about my place in their lives, were built on a version of me that no longer applied. I returned my attention to Linda and gave a small, deliberate nod. "Thank you," I said, and the words carried more weight than their simplicity suggested. She inclined her head slightly in response, her expression calm, as if she had simply confirmed something she had suspected all along. "Some things reveal themselves at the right time," she replied, and then, without another word, she stepped back into the flow of the evening, leaving me standing exactly where I was, but no longer in the same position I had been in before. I remained there for a moment longer, letting the music, the voices, the movement of the room settle into the background once more, but this time, I was not watching to understand what had happened. I already knew. This time, I was considering what would happen next, and for the first time that evening, the thought did not feel uncertain or distant. It felt clear, measured, and entirely within my control. The music grew louder as the evening settled into its rhythm, but for me, everything seemed to slow down, each movement more deliberate, each detail sharper, as if I had stepped slightly outside the flow of the event and could now see it with a clarity that had not been available before. I moved toward the far end of the room where the lighting was softer and the crowd thinned just enough to allow for space between conversations, and I stood there quietly, watching not just what people were doing, but how they were doing it, the subtle shifts in posture, the way certain guests gravitated toward Daniel and Jessica while others kept a respectful distance. The unspoken hierarchy that had formed around them without anyone needing to explain it. It was a carefully constructed environment, one where every element supported the image they wanted to present, and I realized that my role within that environment had been defined just as carefully, not as a participant, but as something peripheral, something to be managed rather than included. I let my gaze move slowly across the room until it settled once again on the two of them, standing at the center of it all, their movements effortless, their expressions relaxed, and I wondered, not for the first time that evening, how long they had been planning this, not just the seating arrangement, but the broader shift, the quiet repositioning that had taken place over weeks, perhaps months, until this moment felt natural to them. I thought back to conversations I had once had with Daniel, moments when he had spoken about responsibility, about family, about the importance of doing what was right even when it was difficult, and I tried to reconcile those memories with the man I was watching now, the one who had looked away when it mattered, the one who had allowed something like this to unfold without hesitation. The contrast was not jarring anymore, not confusing, just clear, like two separate images that no longer needed to be forced together. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne glasses, and I took one without thinking, more out of habit than desire, holding it lightly between my fingers as I continued to observe, the cool surface grounding me in the present moment. Nearby, a group of older guests had gathered, their conversation quieter, more measured, and as I stood within earshot, I caught fragments of their discussion, not about me directly, but about the general state of things, the way traditions had changed, the way respect had become something negotiable rather than assumed. One man shook his head slightly as he spoke, his voice low but steady. There was a time when family meant something different, and another responded with a soft sigh. Times change, but not always for the better. Their words were not directed at anyone in particular, but they carried a weight that settled into the space around them, and I found myself absorbing that weight without resistance, allowing it to reinforce what I had already begun to understand. I took a small sip of the champagne, the taste sharp and fleeting, and set the glass down on the nearest table, leaving it there without a second thought, as if I were shedding something unnecessary, something that no longer served a purpose. The realization that had been forming throughout the evening reached a point of quiet completion then, not as a sudden revelation, but as the final piece of a structure that had been building steadily in the background. This was not a situation that required confrontation, not here, not now, not in a room filled with people who had already chosen their positions, whether consciously or not. This was something else entirely, something that required patience, precision, and a clear understanding of where real influence lay. I thought again of what Linda had said, of the way she had spoken about my husband, about the care he had taken in arranging things, and I felt a subtle shift in my perspective, a movement away from the immediate and toward something larger, something that extended beyond this room and this evening. The power I had been assumed to have lost had not disappeared. It had simply been underestimated. I straightened slightly, adjusting my posture with quiet intention, and let my expression settle into something calm, something unreadable, not out of defensiveness, but out of choice. Across the room, Daniel turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the space briefly before landing in my direction, and for a fraction of a second, our eyes met fully this time, without interruption, without avoidance. There was something in his expression then, something fleeting but unmistakable, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even recognition, as if he had suddenly realized that the version of me he had been relying on, the one who would quietly accept, quietly endure, was no longer the one standing in front of him. I did not hold the moment, did not challenge it, did not give it more weight than it needed. I simply looked back at him, steady and composed, and then allowed my gaze to move on, breaking the connection as easily as it had formed. The music swelled again, drawing attention back to the center of the room, and the moment passed, absorbed into the flow of the evening, unnoticed by anyone else. But for me, it marked something definitive, not an ending, but a beginning, the point at which observation gave way to intention, and intention began to shape what would come next with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. The evening continued to unfold around me, but I no longer experienced it as something I was part of, rather as something I was studying with a calm, deliberate distance, the way one might observe a carefully staged performance after realizing the script had never included them in the first place. I moved toward a quiet corridor just outside the main reception hall, where the music softened into a distant rhythm and the air felt cooler, less crowded with expectation, and I paused there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me in a way that the main room no longer allowed. Through the open doorway, I could still see the glow of the chandeliers, the movement of guests across the dance floor, the easy laughter that rose and fell in waves, but from this vantage point, it all seemed slightly removed, like a scene framed at a distance rather than something I was meant to step back into. I leaned lightly against the wall, not out of fatigue, but out of choice, allowing myself the space to think without interruption, to trace the path that had led to this moment with a clarity that had been missing before. It was not just tonight. It had never been just tonight. The signs had been there, subtle at first, easy to overlook, wrapped in polite language and reasonable explanations, but consistent enough that, when placed side by side, they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. Invitations that arrived after decisions had already been made, conversations that ended when I entered the room, plans that were discussed without my knowledge and then presented as final, each moment small enough to explain away on its own, but together, unmistakable in their direction. I closed my eyes briefly, not to escape the scene, but to organize it, to separate what I had assumed from what I now knew, and when I opened them again, the distinction was clear. This was not carelessness. This was not oversight. This was intention, sustained over time, executed with enough subtlety to avoid open confrontation, but with enough consistency to reshape my place within the family without ever needing to say it aloud. A soft sound behind me drew my attention, and I turned slightly to see the door open a fraction wider as one of the younger staff members stepped into the corridor, carrying an empty tray. She paused when she saw me, her expression briefly uncertain, as if she had not expected anyone to be there, and then she offered a small, polite nod before moving past me toward the service area. As she passed, I noticed the quick glance she gave me, not unkind, but searching, as though she were trying to understand something she had witnessed but did not fully comprehend. I returned the nod without speaking, and as she disappeared down the hall, I found myself considering how easily moments like this were seen by those on the outside, how clearly they could be recognized without the layers of history and assumption that had once clouded my own view. I straightened slightly, pushing away from the wall, and took a slow breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to mark the shift from reflection to decision. There was no need to remain here any longer, not in this corridor and not in the role I had occupied inside that room. I turned back toward the doorway and stepped inside again, the music rising to meet me, the warmth of the lights settling once more across my shoulders, but this time I moved with a different sense of purpose, one that did not seek inclusion or acknowledgement, but simply acknowledged itself. As I crossed the edge of the dance floor, a few guests glanced in my direction, their expressions neutral, their attention fleeting, and I realized that I was no longer concerned with how I was being perceived, whether I was noticed or overlooked, because those measures no longer held the same weight they once had. I walked past the tables, past the place where I had been seated earlier, and did not look at it again, not out of avoidance, but because it no longer required my attention to hold its meaning. Near the exit, I paused briefly, reaching for my coat where it had been hung among the others, the fabric cool beneath my fingers, and I slipped it over my shoulders with the same careful precision I had used when I first arrived, each movement steady, unhurried, unchanged on the surface. As I adjusted the collar, I caught sight of Daniel once more across the room, his attention momentarily shifting as if he had sensed something, and for a second, our eyes met again. But this time, there was no question in my expression, no uncertainty left to interpret. I gave him a small nod, not warm, not cold, simply final, and then I turned toward the door. The sound of the reception followed me only a few steps into the hallway before it softened into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of the building settling into the night. And as I walked toward the exit, my heels echoing softly against the polished floor, I understood that leaving this room was not an act of retreat, but of transition, the first deliberate step away from a place that no longer defined me and towards something that would. The night air felt cooler than I expected when I stepped outside, the quiet settling around me in a way that was almost unfamiliar after the constant movement and noise inside. And for a moment, I simply stood there on the wide stone steps, letting the silence stretch, letting the distance between myself and that room become something real and measurable rather than just emotional. The parking lot was softly lit, rows of cars reflecting the overhead lights in muted patterns, and somewhere in the distance, I could still hear faint echoes of music drifting through the building, but it no longer reached me in the same way, no longer carried the same weight. I adjusted my coat more securely around my shoulders and began walking toward my car, my steps steady, each one grounded in a sense of direction that had not been there when I arrived earlier that evening. As I reached into my purse for my keys, my phone vibrated softly, the sound sharp against the quiet, and I paused before pulling it out, already knowing, in a way that did not require confirmation, who it would be. The screen lit up with Daniel's name, and for a second, I simply looked at it, considering not the message itself, but the timing of it, the fact that it had taken my absence for him to reach out at all. I opened it without urgency, my movements unhurried, and read the short line he had sent. "Where did you go?" There was no punctuation, no warmth, no acknowledgement of anything that had happened, just a question that assumed I had left without reason, as if the evening had unfolded normally, as if my presence or absence were interchangeable details rather than something that should have been understood. I let the message sit on the screen for a moment longer before locking the phone and slipping it back into my purse without responding, not out of anger, but because there was nothing in that message that required an answer, nothing that suggested he was asking the question that actually mattered. I unlocked my car and settled into the driver's seat, closing the door with a soft, controlled motion, and for a moment, I remained there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the interior of the car quiet and contained, separate from everything that had just taken place. It was in that stillness that the final pieces began to align, not just what had happened that evening, but what it meant in a broader sense, beyond the immediate hurt, beyond the surface-level humiliation. This was not about a single event. It was about access, about control, about who held influence over the narrative of this family and who did not. I thought of the house, the one Daniel had grown up in, the one I still maintained, every room holding years of memory, every detail shaped by choices his father and I had made together, and I considered how easily that history had been treated as something secondary, something that could be set aside without consequence. I thought of the accounts, the investments, the careful planning that had gone into ensuring stability, not just for myself, but for the future of the family as a whole, and I realized that, just like everything else, those things had likely been viewed through a lens that underestimated my awareness, my involvement, my authority. I exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and reached for my phone again, this time with intention. I scrolled past Daniel's message without opening it again and selected a different contact, one that had been there for years, rarely used, but never removed. The call connected after only a few rings, and when the familiar voice answered, calm and professional, I felt a sense of alignment that confirmed what I was about to do was not impulsive, not reactive, but measured. "Good evening, Margaret," he said, recognizing my number immediately, and I allowed a brief pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but to ensure that my words carried the clarity I now felt. "I would like to schedule a meeting," I said, my tone even, composed, leaving no room for misinterpretation. There was no need to explain further, not over the phone, not in this moment, and he did not ask for details, only confirmed his availability for the following morning, his voice steady, as if he understood, even without being told, that something significant had shifted. After the call ended, I set the phone down on the passenger seat and started the engine, the soft hum filling the space around me. And as I pulled out of the parking lot, I did not look back at the building, not once, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left behind that required my attention. The road ahead stretched out under the streetlights, clear and unobstructed, and as I drove, I felt no urgency, no need to rush, only a steady sense of movement towards something that had already begun to take shape. Whatever they believed about me, whatever assumptions had guided their choices that evening, they had been built on a version of me that no longer existed, and by the time they realized that, it would not be through confrontation or explanation, but through something far more precise, something that did not require raised voices or public scenes to make its impact understood. The next morning arrived with a quiet steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar, the kind of calm that does not come from everything being right, but from finally seeing things exactly as they are, without distraction, without illusion. I woke early, not out of restlessness, but because there was no longer anything weighing on me in the way there had been before, no unresolved questions circling through my mind, no need to revisit what had already been made clear. The house was silent as I moved through it, the soft light of early morning filtering through the windows, illuminating the details I had known for decades, the furniture, the photographs, the small objects that carried years of memory, and for the first time in a long while, I saw them not as reminders of what had been, but as evidence of what still remained firmly within my control. I prepared my coffee the same way I always had, measured, precise, the routine grounding me without requiring thought, and I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had once done his homework, where we had shared countless meals, where decisions had been made, plans had been formed, and I allowed myself a moment to acknowledge the distance between those memories and the present, not with sadness, but with clarity. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and I arrived exactly on time, stepping into the office with the same composed presence I had carried with me the night before, but now sharpened by purpose. The receptionist greeted me with polite familiarity, and within minutes, I was seated across from a man who had known our family for years, who had worked closely with my husband, who understood not just the documents we had signed, but the intentions behind them. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not offer assumptions. He simply opened the file, reviewed its contents, and looked at me with a quiet attentiveness that indicated he was ready to proceed based on whatever direction I chose to take. "I would like everything updated," I said, my voice even, leaving no room for ambiguity. And as I spoke, I outlined the changes with a level of precision that surprised even me, not because I had not considered them before, but because I had never felt the need to act on them until now. The house, the accounts, the investments, each element carefully reassigned, each decision grounded not in emotion, but in clarity, in a clear understanding of who had demonstrated loyalty, respect, and presence, and who had not. He listened, made notes, asked only the questions necessary to ensure accuracy, and when we were finished, he closed the file with a small nod, as if acknowledging that something significant had just been set into motion. "This will take effect immediately," he said, and I inclined my head slightly in response, not with relief, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet recognition that what needed to be done had been done. When I stepped back outside, the day had fully begun, the streets active, the world moving forward as it always does, indifferent to individual moments, and I returned to my car with the same steady pace I had carried throughout the morning. My phone remained silent during the drive home, but when I parked in the driveway and stepped out, I saw the notification waiting, another message from Daniel, this one longer, though I did not open it right away. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and set my purse down before finally looking at the screen. "We need to talk." It was a simple sentence, but this time, there was something different in it, something less certain, less assumed, and I considered it for a moment before placing the phone on the counter without responding. There would be time for conversation, if it was necessary, but it would not happen on his terms, not as a reaction to something he had only just begun to notice. I walked through the house slowly, pausing briefly in the living room, then the dining room, my gaze moving over each space with a quiet sense of completion, and as I did, I understood that what had shifted was not just the structure of my relationships, but my position within them, my willingness to accept what was given rather than define what was allowed. I moved to the window and looked out at the street, the same view I had seen countless times before, but now, it felt different, not because anything outside had changed, but because I had. The events of the previous evening no longer felt like something that had been done to me, but something that had revealed itself, something that had clarified what needed to be seen, and as I stood there, the final piece of that understanding settled into place with a quiet certainty. They had laughed, believing there would be no consequence, believing that what they had done would pass unnoticed or unchallenged, but consequences do not always arrive loudly, and they do not always announce themselves in the moment they are set in motion. Sometimes they unfold quietly, precisely, in ways that cannot be undone once they are in place, and as I turned away from the window and continued through the house, I knew with complete clarity that what had begun the night before was already moving forward, not as a reaction, but as a decision, one that would define everything that came next without requiring a single raised voice or a single explanation.